Silence. That is the sound history usually reserves for the vanquished. For the German nation in 1945, the silence was deafening. The silence of bombed-out cities, the silence of a defeated ideology, the silence of an absolute, brutal surrender. But buried deep within the records, whispered in memoirs that took decades to surface, lies another sound, one of the most chilling and psychologically complex cries of the post-war era. It is the sound of terror, and it was elicited by the most mundane yet potent symbol of their new reality, a simple, authoritative beat on wood or metal. We are talking about the final forgotten prisoners of the Second World War, the German women POWs. Not the concentration camp survivors, whose suffering is rightly etched into global memory, but the former auxiliaries, nurses, signals officers, and even frontline combatants who were officially classified by the Allied forces as prisoners of war. Tens of thousands of women who had given their youth and fervor to a regime that had spectacularly failed them now found themselves on the wrong side of the wire. Their stories, especially in Western custody, are a dark mirror image of the global conflict. The fighting was over, the violence of battle had ceased, but a new, subtle, and profoundly psychological kind of warfare was just beginning. It was a war against their will, their identity, and their dignity, fought in the cramped, airless confines of hastily constructed internment camps. Imagine the scene. The war is done. You were exhausted, starving, stripped of everything but the clothes on your back and the deep, confusing shame of defeat. You are confined with former comrades and rivals, women from every class and service of a shattered empire. Your captors are the victorious Americans, young, well-fed, and armed, the very people your propaganda taught you to despise and fear. Their relationship was defined by an absolute, irreversible power dynamic. The guards, as they were often grimly nicknamed, controlled every waking and sleeping moment. The key to their survival lay in absolute, numb compliance. To show fear, to show emotion, was to give the enemy a victory far greater than any battlefield conquest. And yet there was one noise that could shatter that fragile control. One sound that bypassed their indoctrination, their discipline, and their fierce nationalistic pride, tearing a primal shriek from their throats. Why? Why the knock? It wasn't the sound of gunfire. It wasn't a shouted threat. It was the simple, percussive thud, thud, thud of a rifle butt, a baton, or a gloved fist striking a wooden door. In the psychology of captivity, the knock is the sound of the world ending. It is the announcement that your tiny enclosed space, the one place you feel minimally safe, is about to be invaded. It is the sudden, violent confirmation that your boundaries are meaningless. It represented the arbitrary, crushing power of the enemy deciding at this exact second who would be called out, who would be interrogated, and who would simply disappear into the depths of the compound. For these women, beaten down by total war, and now clinging to the last fragments of their mental fortitude, the knock was a rupture. It was the sound of the psychological machine confirming its absolute authority. In this video, we will dive into the heart of this post-war trauma. We will explore the historical context of female internment, the brutal monotony of life in an Allied POW camp, and the unique psychological damage inflicted upon a generation of women caught between fanaticism and total collapse. We will use this one chilling phrase, German women POWs screamed when gods knocked, as a lens to examine what happens when the defeated try to find dignity in utter powerlessness, and how the trauma of war doesn't end when the guns fall silent. The first shovelful of dirt Anka lifted felt like she was digging her own grave. The iron head struck a hidden stone with a sharp clang that jarred up her arms and into her teeth. She didn't flinch. Flinching required energy she no longer possessed. The late summer sun of 1945 was a cruel, bright jewel in a sky too vast for this broken earth, baking the mud around the railway line into a cracked gray crust. This was their purpose now, their daily penance, to mend what the war had shattered. To these new masters, the Soviets, they were not women, not individuals with names and histories. They were a workforce, a living, breathing tool to clean up the iron harvest of a lost war. Anka's gaze swept down the line of women, a ragged column of gray and brown dresses stained with sweat and dirt. They were the ghosts of Berlin, Leipzig, Dresden. Their faces were hollowed out, their eyes holding the vacant stare of those who had seen too much. Some, like Elsa, who worked a few feet away, had a cynical hardness to their jaw, a shellacked layer of bitterness that kept the despair at bay. Others, like the older Clara, simply looked weary to the bone, their movements slow and automatic, as if their souls had already departed and only their bodies remained, going through the motions. "Another one for the museum," Elsa muttered, nudging a twisted piece of shrapnel with her boot. Her voice was a dry rasp, stripped of all emotion. She had been a former secretary, her once deft fingers now calloused and cracked. She had told Anka, in a rare moment of confidence during a rainstorm, that she missed the weight of a pen, not a shovel. Anka offered a weak smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. At 22, she felt decades older. Her own hands, trained for the delicate work of nursing, checking pulses, adjusting bandages, offering comfort, were now just instruments for moving rubble. The memory of the hospital in Berlin, the smell of antiseptic fighting a losing battle against the stench of blood and decay, was a fresh wound. She had fled the final chaotic Soviet advance, only to be captured a week later trying to find her way to a rumored safe zone. Her uniform, a simple nurse's dress, had become her prison garb. A sharp whistle blew, the sound cutting through the humid air. The guards, young Soviet soldiers with faces that seemed both bored and dangerously tense, gestured for them to move to a new section of track. Their eyes, when they bothered to look at the women, held a mixture of contempt and a flicker of something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or a latent anger that these representatives of the hated fascists were now their responsibility. The dawn arrived not as a relief, but as an accusation. Gray light filtered through the grimy windows of the barracks, illuminating the faces of the women who had barely slept. The empty bunk where Lottie had slept was a raw, open wound in the center of the room. No one looked at it directly, but every furtive glance, every courtesy-avoided angle of the head confirmed its terrifying presence. It was a void that screamed louder than Lottie's final cries. Anka moved through the morning routine like an automaton. The watery ersatz coffee tasted of ashes. The silence in the barracks was thick and heavy, broken only by the necessary functional sounds of dressing. The usual morning coughs and muttered complaints were absent, smothered by a blanket of shared dread. On the work line, the change was palpable. The guards seemed sharper, their eyes more watchful. The women, in turn, worked with a new, frantic intensity. Heads were kept down, postures bent in a perpetual cringe. It was as if they all believed that, by being the most productive, the most invisible, they could avoid the fate that had befallen Lottie. Anka watched Elsa, who was attacking a pile of rubble with a ferocity that was entirely unlike her usual cynical lethargy. "She was from Hamburg," Elsa muttered, not looking at Anka, her words punctuated by the scrape of her shovel. "She talked in her sleep. Maybe they heard her. Maybe they don't like crying." Anka didn't reply. She was counting. It was a habit from the hospital, a way to impose order on chaos. Count the wounded, count the supplies. Now she counted the women on her section of the line. 43. She had made a mental note the day before. 44. Lottie made 44. The number gnawed at her. Days bled into one another, each a carbon copy of exhaustion and fear. The initial sharp terror of Lottie's disappearance began to dull, replaced by a low-grade, constant anxiety that hummed in the background of every waking moment. It was during this time that the whispers began. They started at night, in the safety of the darkness that hid their faces. Low, hesitant voices from adjacent bunks. "I heard she was sick, a fever. She coughed at roll call yesterday," one woman whispered. "No, it's the troublemakers," came another voice from the shadows. "Remember when she dropped that rail tie last week? The guard shouted at her. She's on a list." A list. The word hung in the air, terrifying in its bureaucratic finality. Was there a list? Was their fate being decided on some clipboard in Lieutenant Volkov's office? Then, 17 days after the first event, it happened again. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was exactly the same firm, unhurried rhythm. It was not a request for entry, it was an announcement of intent. This time the silence that fell was even more absolute, a vacuum of sound that sucked the air from the room. The door opened, the same two guards. The flashlight beam sliced through the dark, a blade of white light. It swept, hesitated, and landed on a woman named Hannelore, a former cook who had a persistent hacking cough that had been keeping her section of the barracks awake. She didn't scream. She let out a single choked sob, a sound of utter defeat, as the guards pulled her to her feet. She went limp, a dead weight they had to drag. The lack of a struggle was, in its own way, more horrifying than Lottie's frantic terror. It suggested a knowledge, a resignation, that was profoundly unsettling. The door closed. The silence returned. This time, however, the fear was different. It was no longer a formless monster in the dark. It had a shape. It had a schedule. It had a pattern. The next morning, Anka sought out Elsa as they received their meager ration of bread. 17 days, Anka said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. Elsa's eyes, sunken in their sockets, flickered with understanding. What? 17 days between Lottie and Hannelore. Elsa stared at her, the cynical shield momentarily down, revealing the sharp intelligence beneath. "You're counting." "Aren't you?" Anka countered. They began their own silent investigation. They observed. They listened. Anka, with her nurse's eye for detail, started cataloging not just numbers, but conditions. She noted who had a limp, who had developed a rash, who seemed more withdrawn than usual. Elsa, with her secretary's mind for systems and hierarchies, watched the guards. She noted their rotations, which ones were more volatile, which ones seemed to take orders directly from Volkov. Their theory about sickness was tested and found both true and insufficient. Hannelore was sick, but so were others who were not taken. Their theory about troublemakers was the same. It was a factor, but not the rule. Paranoia, that most corrosive of emotions, began to seep into the cracks of their tiny society. Trust, a fragile commodity in the best of times, began to evaporate. Women who had shared scraps of food now eyed each other with suspicion. A casual complaint about a guard, once a shared bonding ritual, was now a potential death sentence. What if the person you complained to was an informant, currying favor with the authorities by pointing out the malcontents? Anka saw it happen. A woman named Brigitte, once part of Greta's circle of loyalists, was now shunned by them. Whispers circulated that she had been seen speaking to a guard near the latrines. No one knew what was said, but the accusation was enough. Brigitte became a ghost, eating alone, working alone, her every move watched with hostile eyes. The enemy was no longer just outside the wire, it was inside the barracks, sitting on the next bunk. 3 weeks and 2 days after Hannelore was taken, the knock came again. This time, the women were not just passive. As the boots approached the barracks after lights out, a frantic, hushed movement rippled through the room. Women pulled blankets over their heads, pressed themselves against the walls, trying to make themselves smaller, to disappear into the very wood of their bunks. Knock, knock, knock. The beam of light entered. It was slower this time, more deliberate, as if the guards enjoyed the theater of it. It swept back and forth, a searchlight over a prison yard. It paused on a face, moved on, then returned. It settled on Brigitte, the suspected informant. She didn't make a sound. She simply stood up, her face a pale, blank mask, and walked towards the guards. Her compliance was absolute. It was as if she had been expecting it, waiting for the price of her perceived betrayal to be collected. The door closed, and the silence felt different this time. Not just of fear, but of a grim, savage satisfaction for some. As the days ticked by, Anka's mental tally grew. Lottie, Hannelore, Brigitte. The intervals were not perfectly precise, 17 days, then 23 days, but they were close enough to suggest a system, a culling. One evening, as they hauled broken bricks into a cart, Elsa leaned close to Anka, her breath a ghost in the cold air. "It's not about who is sick or who is a troublemaker," she whispered, her eyes darting to ensure no one was close. "It's about the count." The count? The numbers. Volkov has to report his numbers to someone. The Red Cross, maybe, or his superiors. He can't have them dying too quickly from disease or starvation. It would look bad. So she let the sentence hang. Anka felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Elsa was right. It wasn't personal. It was administrative. The knock was a macabre form of inventory control. They were removing. The world shrank to the rhythm of the shovel and the shadow of the knock, a 17 to 23-day countdown that ticked like a dead man's clock in the back of every woman's mind, a dread that curdled the watery soup and turned the very air in the barracks to thick, breathable fear, a fear that made allies into suspects and every cough a potential death sentence. And it was in this pressure cooker of paranoia that a sliver of unexpected opportunity presented itself, not as a key to freedom, but as a window into the machine's inner workings. For Anke, whose nursing experience was a useless relic in this place of deliberate decay, was summoned one morning not to the rubble line, but to the camp's infirmary, a drafty shed that smelled of gangrene and cheap vodka, a place where the Soviet doctor, a harried, middle-aged man named Alexei, presided over a kingdom of suffering with bloodshot eyes and trembling hands, his own a battlefield of fatigue and, Anke suspected, the bottle. And he needed an assistant, someone, anyone, who could distinguish a fracture from a festering wound. And Anke, with her clean, efficient movements and knowledge of bandages, became that someone. A decision that pulled her from the anonymous mass of prisoners and placed her in a precarious new orbit, closer to the guards, closer to the whispers, closer to the source of the terror. Her new duties were a grim parody of her past life, holding down a feverish woman while Alexei lanced a boil, sorting meager supplies of aspirin and iodine, watching him suture a gash on a guard's hand with a drunkard's careful concentration. And it was here, amid the antiseptic and the anguish, that she began to gather fragments, the scattered pieces of the pattern, overhearing a guard complain about transport duty in a tone of disgust, seeing a scrap of paper on Alexei's desk with Cyrillic script and a column of numbers that looked hauntingly like a roster, noticing how the guards who served under Volkov would avoid the doctor's gaze, their faces closed and hard. And it was on a rain-swept afternoon, as she was cleaning rusted surgical tools, that she witnessed something that cemented the horrifying logic of it all. For they brought in a young Ukrainian guard, Ivan, his leg mangled from a mishap with a truck. And as Alexei, sober for once, worked to stem the bleeding, Lieutenant Volkov himself strode into the infirmary, his presence sucking the warmth from the room, his eyes not on the injured boy, but on Alexei. And he asked, not with concern, but with cold bureaucratic efficiency, "Will he be fit for duty?" And when Alexei, after a tense pause, shook his head and said no, not for weeks if ever, Volkov's face showed no emotion. He simply made a note on a small clipboard he carried and said, "See that he is comfortable," before turning and leaving. And the look on young Ivan's face was not of pain, but of a deeper, more profound terror. A look Anke had seen before in the barracks during the knock, the terror of being deemed surplus. And she understood then that the machine did not discriminate, it consumed its own just as readily. And the infirmary was not just a place of healing, it was another filter, another way to identify the weak. And she was now standing right in the center of it, a witness to the cold, mechanical heart of the beast. And the knowledge was a heavier burden than any shovel. The silence in Block C was never truly silent. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from 1,000 tiny, miserable sounds. The rustle of cheap straw in thin mattresses, the rhythmic grating cough of Frau Schmidt, a souvenir from the forced march, and the soft, ragged sighs that escaped from the lips of 70 women, each one a testament to shattered futures. But tonight, that composite sound was eclipsed by a different kind of quiet, a strained, taut silence that felt like a plucked wire ready to snap. They were German women, officers and auxiliaries, technicians and nurses, now stripped down to the lowest common denominator of humanity, prisoners of war, housed in a makeshift compound carved out of a derelict textile factory in the occupied zone. Their captors, American military police, tough, weary men who mostly treated them with professional detachment, had established a routine of drudgery and minimal sustenance. It was predictable, therefore, bearable. It was the unpredictable that held their terror, and the knock was the harbinger of that unpredictable horror. It was not the main door being kicked open, That was the sound of a routine inspection, a guard change, or the delivery of the meager supper ration. This was different. This was a sharp, focused, insistent rapping, 3 swift, heavy blows delivered directly onto the flimsy plywood of their communal sleeping quarters door, a sound that cut through the darkness with the suddenness and finality of a guillotine blade. It wasn't a human fest. The guards, the gods, as the women's fearful slang had twisted the word, always used the flat of their boots or a baton. This sound was hard, round, metallic. The heavy head of a flashlight, perhaps, or the heel of a sidearm. It carried a terrible, deliberate authority. Within the instant the sound vanished, replaced by an inrush of collective breath, the air in the room seemed to congeal. 70 hearts slammed against 70 ribs, a frantic, muted drum corps in the gloom. Corporal Renat Haas, who had been lying awake staring at the grimy ceiling, the one with the brown stain that looked ominously like a map of a burning continent, squeezed her eyes shut. She was the ranking officer in the room, a former signals analyst who had seen enough of the war's brutal logic to know that a knock in the dead of night was never benign. It meant selection. It meant a breach of the already thin-stretched rules of the Geneva Convention. It meant the arbitrary application of power, the kind that reminded them they were not just soldiers anymore, but women in a foreign camp, objects of scrutiny and potential malice. The screaming started almost immediately. Not a unified shriek, but a ragged, desperate chorus that climbed the register like a sick musical scale. It was the sound of surrender before the fight even began. Frau Major Dr. Hannelore Müller, the camp's unofficial moral anchor, a physician who had served on the Eastern Front, pressed her hands against her mouth, a low guttural wail escaping through her fingers. Next to her, 17-year-old Liesel, barely more than a child conscripted into the flak auxiliaries, sprang upright with a gasp, her body shaking so violently that the cot rattled against the concrete floor. "Nein, nein, bitte," she whimpered, her voice cracking like dry kindling. This wasn't the brave, defiant noise of soldiers facing an assault. It was the raw, primal terror of the vulnerable, knowing the barrier between them and the outside world had just been breached by nothing more than a sound. They screamed because the sound was a hammer blow against the psychological wall they had built for self-preservation. Renat forced herself to sit up, ignoring the tremor in her own legs. The oil lamp near the door had been extinguished hours ago, leaving the room in a state of deep, unforgiving shadow, relieved only by a thin, sickly moonlight filtering through the high, barred windows. The screaming intensified, one woman's fear igniting another's, a self-sustaining bonfire of panic. Renat knew she had to stop it. The noise would only antagonize their captors and justify a more brutal response. "Quiet! Still! All of you! Shut up! That is an order!" Renat's voice, though not loud, carried the sharp metallic ring of command, honed over years of shouting into a radio set over the roar of flak. For a moment it cut through the din. A few sobs hitched, caught, and then silence, punctuated only by heavy, ragged breathing and the faint, distant echo of a sentry's boot on the gravel outside. The door burst open then, not kicked, but shoved inward with a tremendous, splintering thud that proved more terrifying than the knock itself. The frame protested with a loud crack. Silhouetted in the doorway stood, not one, but 3 figures, their shapes made monstrous by the low-slung, powerful beam of a military flashlight. The gods. They wore the heavy, dark greatcoats of the U.S. Army MP Corps, their helmets adding to their menacing height. The figure in the center, the one holding the flashlight, was clearly the one who had knocked. The light, held waist-high, swung erratically, but its main thrust was directed at the faces of the women closest to the door, momentarily blinding them and turning the rest of the room into a deep, impenetrable well of darkness. "Ruhe!" roared one of the guards, his German guttural and thickly accented, betraying a probable background in an American-German community. a fact that always chilled the women more than the pure English of the others. It was a familiar word, but delivered with an unfamiliar cold fury that suggested he had been listening to their terror and found it irritating. The center guard, a tall, imposing man whose face was hidden in the shadow of his helmet brim, stepped inside. His eyes, the only visible feature, swept across the women's huddled forms. He held a clipboard in his free hand. He was the one, Renat realized, with a sickening jolt, who had been responsible for the previous night's unsettling incident, the confiscation of several small personal photos under the guise of contraband clearance. The women had seen him before, and his presence always signaled an escalation of psychological pressure. "Captain Renat Haas," the man stated, his English slow and precise, the words hanging in the air like icicles. He was reading from the clipboard, proving that this was, at least nominally, an official action, a piece of bureaucratic cruelty. Renat felt her spine lock. She pushed herself off the cot, instinctively straightening her crumpled, ill-fitting uniform shirt. "Here," she replied, her voice steady despite the seismic trembling inside her chest. Every woman's eyes were locked on her, an unbearable weight of shared anxiety. The guard shone a flashlight directly into her eyes. "You will accompany us. Now. Uniform on, no talking." He didn't offer a reason. He didn't need to. The total absence of explanation was the most powerful part of his technique. It allowed the women's imaginations to run wild, filling the void with every horror story they had ever heard about internment, interrogation, and the fate of captured personnel in wartime. Another wave of repressed screaming welled up in the room. This time, however, it was more of a collective moan, a low, despairing sound that vibrated with deep existential fear. They screamed because Renat was being taken, and in a prisoner of war camp, being singled out was synonymous with being targeted. They screamed because they knew that the guard's next target could be any of them, pulled away for an unknown, terrifying purpose that military protocol often thinly veiled. They screamed because they were helpless, their military training a meaningless scrap of paper in this damp, dark room, their gender now their most prominent and dangerous vulnerability. The metallic knock had signaled the end of their brief, fragile illusion of safety. Renat's departure signaled the beginning of their collective dread's physical manifestation. The guard gestured with the beam of light, pointing toward the door. As Renat walked past, she caught the look at Frau Mayor's face, a mixture of cold rage and resigned pity. Muller gave a minute, almost imperceptible nod, a silent order: "Be strong, do not break." It was all the encouragement Renat was going to get. The two other gods moved aside to let her pass, their expressions unreadable in the poor light. As she stepped out into the frigid night air of the compound corridor, the sound of the German women's muffled screams and sobs became a distant, chilling thing, a memory already, but also a stark reminder of what awaited her if she failed to return. Her heart hammered the rhythm of the march into the unknown, a silent continuation of the fear that had just exploded in the barracks. Renat could still hear that initial terrible knock, 3 short, sharp sounds that had brought the flimsy walls of their defiance tumbling down. She wondered if she would ever hear it again. The silence was the loudest thing in the barracks. It was a dense, suffocating blanket that pressed down on every woman, far more unbearable than the shrieking air raids of the past weeks. Elsa pressed her face into the rough wool of her blanket, listening not to the silence itself, but to the strained absence of sound it contained. They were 2 days into what the camp guards vaguely called a security lockdown. No work detail, no mess hall, just the 4 gray walls of Barracks 3 and the 30 women inside, the air thick with unwashed bodies and unvoiced fear. The terror that had started with a dull ache in their collective gut was now a sharp, incessant pain. It wasn't the guards they feared most in this enforced isolation. It was the unknown. The whispers passed like contraband cigarettes, each rumor more outlandish and terrifying than the last. They had faced bombs and hunger. They had endured the casual cruelty of their captors. But this stillness, this sense of being deliberately forgotten, was designed to dismantle the very core of their sanity. A sudden, sharp thump, thump, thump of something hard hitting the main wooden door shattered the quiet. It wasn't the rhythmic, heavy boot steps of the usual evening inspection. Those were a familiar terror. This sound was irregular, almost frantic, a strange, nervous hammering. Every woman froze. Elsa's heart lurched, a frantic drum against her ribs, echoing the sound at the door. Beside her, Liesel, who usually had a cynical comment for every situation, let out a small, strangled whimper. The noise stopped as abruptly as it began. For a long, agonizing minute, nothing happened. The tension coiled tighter, drawing every breath in the room into a single shallow inhale. Then a low guttural noise scraped against the wood, a sound that could have been a cough or a suppressed shout or something else entirely, something inhuman. Gods. That was the word that flashed through Elsa's mind, a word she hadn't heard since her grandmother's folk tales. The little demons of bad luck who scratched at the window before a fever took hold. The modern term, the brutal, real-world equivalent, was guard, but in the dark, the primitive word felt truer. The door's bolt slid back with a squeal that sounded like a saw blade cutting through bone. The remaining women, the ones who hadn't been transferred, the ones whose names hadn't appeared on a list, could only watch. The door creaked inward, not revealing the hulking silhouette of Sergeant Roth as expected, but a much smaller figure. It was a young man, barely older than a boy, clad in a uniform that seemed too large for his slight frame. He looked terrified, his eyes wide and darting, sweat glistening on his pale forehead beneath the brim of his helmet. He didn't step in, he just held the door open a crack. In his gloved hands, he held something small and awkwardly wrapped in a piece of faded canvas. The terror in the room was instantaneously replaced by a bewildering confusion. This wasn't a beating, this wasn't an interrogation, this was delivery. The boy guard fumbled with the bundle, his nervousness making the action clumsy. He finally managed to shove it through the opening and then, without a word, slammed the door shut and shot the bolt home. The echoing thunk of the lock was followed by the sound of his quick, panicked footsteps running down the corridor. It took several seconds for anyone to move. Then Hannah, the oldest among them, and the unspoken leader, rose slowly. Her movements were careful, methodical, as if she were wading through water. She approached the small, innocuous bundle lying on the dusty concrete floor, a strange beacon in the dim light filtering through the high barred window. The silence in the barracks was absolute once more. But this time, it was a silence of profound, suspended curiosity. Hannah knelt, her joints popping audibly, and gingerly pulled back the canvas. It wasn't a weapon, it wasn't a message, it wasn't a bomb. It was a loaf of bread. Not the usual coarse, sawdust-filled prison ration, but a small, perfectly baked dark brown loaf, still faintly warm, with a hard, shiny crust. Tucked beside it was a single, perfect apple, a deep, polished crimson. The colors, the rich brown and the bright red, were so jarringly vibrant against the grayness of the camp that they seemed like an optical illusion. It was an unexpected offering. Hannah gently picked up the loaf, weighing it in her hand. It was heavy, dense, with real flour, a weight that hadn't been felt in this room in years. She looked at the circle of women surrounding her, their faces pale and etched with disbelief. Was it a test? A trick? Poison? Their lives were built on suspicion. Kindness was the only thing they could not afford to trust. But the smell! Oh, the smell! The deep, nutty aroma of fresh-baked bread, a smell of home, of childhood kitchens, of a life that felt like it belonged to a history book. It was a physical assault on their malnourished senses. Liesel started to cry. Silent tears tracked clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. "Hannah," she choked out, "it's—" Hannah didn't answer. She took the apple and with a swift, decisive move, she snapped it in half. A slight dry cracking sound split the air. The flesh inside was white and firm. She did the same to the loaf, tearing it unevenly down the middle. She tasted a tiny, minuscule piece of the crust. She waited. 5 seconds, 10. Her expression didn't change. Finally, she nodded. "It's good," she whispered, her voice husky. The reverberation of the gods knocking, the heavy, echoing impacts against the thick steel of the temporary stockade door, did not cease with the initial piercing wave of screams. It pulsed through the makeshift barracks, a brutal metallic heartbeat that drove a spike of pure crystalline terror into the breast of every woman within. Elsa pressed her back against the cold, damp stone of the wall, her breath catching in ragged, shallow gasps. She didn't recognize the shriek that had torn from her own throat moments before. It was an animal sound, raw and utterly divorced from the composed young woman she had, until only days ago, still believed herself to be. The screaming had subsided into a chorus of broken whimpers and fervent, silent prayers, a thick, suffocating blanket of dread woven by the 60-odd German women huddled inside. They were German, yes, former auxiliary staff, nurses, Helferinnen, but now they were simply women, captured and confined, and the sound of a forceful entry, particularly after days of psychological tension, had shattered their fragile grip on civility. The gods, or gods as they had been fearfully whispering among themselves, the coarse, foreign-tongued men assigned to their compound, were not simply knocking, they were attempting to breach the final, flimsy barrier between the women's terrified sanctuary and the unpredictable darkness outside. Every successive thud was a hammer blow against their resolve, a chilling reminder of their total, absolute vulnerability. Gretchen, the medic, whose stoic demeanor had been the anchor for the last 3 days, slid down the wall until she sat, rocking slightly, her eyes wide and fixed on the door's warped outline where the pale moonlight bled through a crack. She had seen the worst of the Eastern Front, patched-up men whose bodies were ruins, yet this sound, this simple rhythmic violation of their space, broke her. "Sie kommen," she whispered, a low, guttural sound of finality that needed no translation for the others. "They are coming." The fear, however, was suddenly, violently interrupted. The thunderous assault on the door didn't climax with a splintering crash. Instead, it was replaced by a sharp, foreign command barked out in a clipped, unfamiliar cadence, immediately followed by the distinct, mechanical clatter of a heavy bolt being thrown, not from the outside, but from somewhere close, metallic and sharp. A single, overwhelmingly powerful light, blinding white and aggressive, then flooded the interior, making the women recoil and throw up their arms to shield their eyes. The light was the first shock, the second was the figure framed in the sudden brilliance. It was not one of the coarse, bearded men they feared. It was a woman. She was tall, authoritative, clad in a crisp, dark uniform that was unfamiliar, yet undeniably military and clean. She carried a clipboard and stood with a posture of weary impatience, surveying the cowering group. A man, a guard, but not one of their guards. This one was older, with a kind of resigned professionalism, stood just behind her, his rifle slung, not leveled. The sudden, drastic shift from imminent physical threat to a formal administrative presence created a momentary dizzying silence, a vacuum where fear and hope wrestled. Hilda, a young student whose idealism had been ground to dust by the horrors of the last year, felt a hot, dizzying wave of nausea wash over her. This wasn't the end she had imagined. This was a process. The woman in the doorway let out a sigh, a profound, tired sound that seemed to carry the exhaustion of the entire war. She spoke not in the low German they understood, but in clear, resonant English. All right, ladies, the screaming stops now. This is a transfer. You are being moved to a designated holding facility that complies with the Geneva Conventions. This compound is obsolete. Collect your belongings, what little you have. You have 15 minutes. A translator, a small, nervous man in an ill-fitting civilian suit, who had materialized from the darkness behind the guard, stammered the translation into German. As the words registered, transfer, designated holding facility, Geneva Conventions, the air in the barracks fractured. It wasn't a sudden burst of relief, not yet. It was a confused, hesitant, slow-motion wave of realization. The immediate, localized fear of assault and abuse, the kind that had fueled their primal screams, evaporated, replaced by the staggering magnitude of their new reality. They were now formally recognized, processed, and subject to international law, however thin that shield might be. They were moving from a terrifying, lawless shadow place into the cold, structured reality of being official prisoners of war. Elsa, who had been holding her breath for what felt like hours, finally exhaled. It was a shaky, involuntary sob that brought it with it the tears of relief and realization the chapter was named for. They were not tears of pure joy, but a messy, ugly discharge of suppressed terror. The sound was quickly echoed across the room. The women, who had been frozen in positions of defensive horror, began to move, not toward their meager belongings, but toward each other. Liesel, who had been sobbing silently into her shawl, lifted her head and locked eyes with Gretchen. In that look, there was a profound, unspoken acknowledgement. They had survived the screaming. They had survived the immediate, mortal fear. The unknown that lay ahead, the journey, the interrogations, the long, grinding years of confinement, was daunting, horrifying even, but it was a known type of horror, one that came with rules, distant they were. The primal fear was gone. The transition from being merely captured women to registered POWs felt like the difference between sinking in a dark sea and finally grasping a lifeboat. The tears flowed not because of happiness, but because the unbearable, absolute stress of the last 72 hours had finally, definitively broken. They had made it through the night. The gods had knocked, and what opened was not a monster, but a door to a complicated, terrible, yet ultimately more structured future. The clang of the steel gate slamming shut behind them was not just an end to their long, humiliating transport, it was the definitive full stop on the sentence of their freedom. For the German women, many of them former auxiliaries, nurses, and even direct combatants, though the official American paperwork called them simply prisoners of war, the journey had been a blur of rattling trucks, harsh kerosene lamps, and the constant, sickening realization that their great thousand-year Reich had evaporated like mist. This new compound, a hastily converted barracks surrounded by double rows of barbed wire and freshly dug trenches, was a stark contrast to the makeshift prisons of the immediate post-war chaos. Here there was order, there was clean gravel, and there were, most terrifyingly, gods, the American military police, with their crisp uniforms and unnervingly quiet demeanor, who now controlled every aspect of their lives. The air hung heavy with a mixture of fear, resignation, and a deep-seated, stubborn Teutonic pride that hadn't quite been beaten out of them yet. They were marched in columns of 3, their worn-out uniforms, some still bearing the faded insignia of their service, clinging to their tired bodies. The guards were young, mostly Midwestern or Southern boys who looked as though they'd rather be anywhere else, but their eyes held a professional, detached hardness that was perhaps more unnerving than open hostility. Helga Voss, a former Nachrichtenhelferin, signals auxiliary, who had served in Berlin until the final weeks, rubbed the raw skin on her wrist where the identification tag chafed. She looked over at Renat, a grim-faced nurse whose calm resolve had been the anchor for their small group during the journey. Renat simply stared straight ahead, a muscle twitching in her jaw, a silent vow of defiance against the humiliation. They had survived Allied bombing, the Russian advance, and the moral collapse of their world. They would survive this. The initial processing was swift and brutal in its efficiency. Names, ranks, or lack thereof, birth dates, and a cursory medical check. The women were stripped of anything deemed a potential weapon or item of intelligence. Pocket knives, belt buckles, photographs, and most painfully for some, small, treasured pieces of jewelry, a wedding band, a locket holding a mother's hair. "This is not a vacation camp," a young bespectacled American lieutenant with a clipboard informed them in clipped, heavily accented German. "You will follow orders. You will work. You will keep silent unless spoken to. Any breach of rules will be met with immediate and severe disciplinary action." The words themselves were standard military rhetoric, but the context, the fact that this was happening to them, the women, who were supposed to be the backbone and future of the Volk, sent a cold shiver through the assembled group. They were assigned to barrack blocks, large, echoing wooden structures that smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale cigarette smoke. Each block was further subdivided into cramped rooms, 8 women per space, their beds nothing more than canvas-stretched cots. There was no privacy, no personal space, and the communal latrines were a source of immediate and intense friction. It was the forced intimacy, the sudden, unavoidable closeness with strangers, women from different cities, different services, and even different social classes, that began the slow internal rot of their morale. The comradeship of a shared ideology, the bond forged in the fires of war, quickly gave way to the pettiness and territoriality of captivity. It was during the first evening, as the weak electric lights flickered on, casting long, unsettling shadows, that the first true shock arrived. A small, frail woman named Liesel, caught trying to conceal a tiny, tarnished silver cross, was being escorted out of the processing room back to the barracks by 2 American MPs. The silence of the compound was broken by a sudden, jarring noise. German women POWs screamed when gods knocked. The sound was a sharp, percussive thud-thud-thud, the butt of a rifle or perhaps a wooden baton against the metal doorframe of the processing shed. It was a noise of authority, of casual, overwhelming power. Liesel didn't cry out, she simply sagged, the silver cross tumbling to the ground, but her fear, palpable and intense, translated into a collective, spontaneous shriek that tore from the throats of the women huddled in the barracks courtyard. It was a sound not of injury, but of pure psychological terror, the noise of the machine confirming its absolute control. The American guards froze, momentarily stunned by the raw, animalistic sound, a sound so unlike the stoic, disciplined enemy they had been trained to expect. It was a sound that stripped away rank and uniform, leaving only terrified human beings. The lieutenant in charge barked an order into the sudden silence, and the women were hustled inside the barracks, the atmosphere now brittle and charged. That moment, the primal scream at the sound of a simple, authoritative knock became the unspoken signature of Chapter 7, a new kind of captivity. They were no longer fighting a war, they were fighting a daily battle against the slow erosion of their dignity, their identity, and their will. The days that followed settled into a grinding, monotonous routine, a schedule designed not just for control, but for the deliberate exhaustion of their spirit. Reveille at dawn, followed by a meager breakfast of watery oatmeal and ersatz coffee. Then work details. The Americans, practical and still grappling with the massive logistics of occupying a defeated nation, put them to use. They were made to clean the entire compound, launder the clothes of the American officers, sort through endless piles of captured documents, and, most tediously of all, shell mountains of potatoes for the officers' mess. The work was hard, physical labor that left their hands rough and their backs aching, yet it was the only thing that offered a fleeting sense of purpose in their otherwise pointless existence. In the evenings, after a thin, unsatisfying dinner, they were locked into their barracks. It was during these hours that the true nature of their captivity revealed itself. In the absence of external threat, the women turned inward. Political arguments flared up, sharp and bitter. Some still clung fiercely to the belief in the ultimate righteousness of the cause, whispering rumors of secret weapons and an inevitable counterattack that would turn the tide. Others, the realists, the ones who had seen the bombed-out ruins of Dresden and the chaos of the final days, railed against the leadership that had betrayed them. "We were lied to," one woman, a secretary from the propaganda ministry, cried out one night, her voice cracking with fury. "We gave everything, our brothers, our futures, our very souls, for a lie." These nightly arguments were policed not by the Americans, but by an internal hierarchy that quickly formed. The stronger, more dominant personalities, often former officers or women with a high rank in the party organization, asserted control, using fear and ideological leverage to silence dissent. Renate, the nurse, remained a neutral force, an island of pragmatic sanity. She focused on the practicalities, patching up scraped knees, dealing with the persistent coughs that swept through the barracks, and most importantly, hoarding scraps of food and any small item that might prove useful. She knew that survival lay not in political posturing, but in quiet, steady endurance. The psychological warfare, however subtle, continued unabated. The American Guards would occasionally play cheerful swing-era music over the loudspeakers, a stark, mocking contrast to the somber, militaristic music they were used to. They were given old magazines with pictures of robust, smiling American families and brightly colored advertisements for goods they would never be able to afford. It was a constant, shimmering vision of the abundant, victorious life they had lost, a subtle pressure designed to break their will and turn them against their past. Helga, the former signals auxiliary, found herself staring at an advertisement for a refrigerator, an appliance so utterly mundane yet so impossibly luxurious in their current circumstances that she felt a physical wrench in her gut. It was a sorrow far deeper than the loss of the war. It was the loss of a future, any future that contained such simple, uncomplicated comfort. The rules of conduct were absolute and enforced with a casual indifference that was deeply unsettling. The few women who attempted escape, driven mad by the claustrophobia and the endless monotony, were quickly apprehended and subjected to a harsh, though non-violent, regimen of solitary confinement in a small damp shed with only bread and water. But the punishment for them served a greater purpose. It was a spectacle for the rest. When the escapees were finally brought back, pale and hollow-eyed, their silence was far more effective deterrent than any barbed wire fence. It taught the others that the boundaries of their new captivity were not just physical, they were mental. The greatest challenge, Renate realized, was maintaining a sense of self. Everything about the camp was designed to reduce them to a number, a uniform, a generic enemy female. The daily grind blurred the edges of their personalities. To counteract this, she began a quiet rebellion, a nightly ritual. She would spend 5 minutes mentally recounting a perfect day from her life before the war, the smell of freshly baked Apfelkuchen, a summer day on the Baltic coast, the feel of a surgical instrument perfectly balanced in her hand,